Thanks everyone for joining today. I'll spend the next hour kind of going through some of the core concepts of Gadget and how it works. So very high level, but interactive, where I'll actually build an example of a blog while showing you some of the concepts of Gadget. And then once I've kind of gone through some of those core concepts, what I'm going to do is relate it back to the Shopify connection that we offer and how that works, because the Shopify connection leverages those same core concepts. So my hope is by the end of the hour, you have a really good understanding of what Gadget is, how it fits in your stack, and some of the core pieces that you use as building blocks to build your applications. And then you can apply those to your own projects as you need to. So I will share my screen. I'll be going through a set of slides and talking through the product as I navigate and show you around. And towards the end of the call, we'll have time for a Q&A. I know there's been a bunch of submitted questions. I will do my best to get through as many of them as possible. Ooh, there's more folks joining. Sorry, 1 second. There we go. Yeah, someone else is letting them in. That's perfect. So today's agenda, pretty short. I will explain the Gadget stack, like what the pieces are that we give you, because we give you quite a lot of infrastructure. I'll explain the Gadget framework. I'll use the example of a blog just to kind of show you the pieces. It's a little bit easier to explain with a simple example like a blog. But then it's very likely that the vast majority of you are here to learn about how to build Shopify apps. So I'll go through the Shopify connection that we give you and how it delivers the same building blocks that I'm going to explain, and how you kind of hook off of those to build your Shopify app. And then I think today we will not have time to do a actual end-to-end app build, an interactive example. So I'm going to replace this last one with just like a Q&A once we get to it. I am not going to share my slides as a slideshow, just because I'm going to keep going back and forth between tabs. If anyone is having trouble seeing the actual slide or the content on the slide at any point in time, just raise your hand. Or type a note in the chat, and one of my colleagues who's here will probably catch my attention and I'll zoom in. But I'm hoping you folks can see everything here. So let's start. What is Gadget? So Gadget is a serverless development platform that helps you build, host, and scale web apps in a fraction of the time that it would normally take you. So it is both where you build your application, you define your logic, and you write code. And you don't have to use our text editor. I don't mean that. You can use your preferred text editor, but all of the code lives within Gadget. It is where your application is actually productionized. All of the infrastructure is provided by Gadget. We give you a Node.js backend, a React front end, a Postgres database, and there's zero setup required. I'll show you what that means. As soon as you start a Gadget project, all of these pieces are live on the internet, and they have a URL that you can actually go and inspect yourself. We also give you a framework for building web apps that handles a lot of the boilerplate code, and it lets you kind of focus your time on the business logic that makes your application unique. And ultimately, that's what saves you a lot of time. On average, for Shopify apps, which is kind of our core bread and butter these days, most merchants and agencies that use the platform report time savings about 50 to 70% for their development team. And that's because so much of the work developers do is boilerplate infrastructure, boilerplate code, and the same nonsense we've built over and over again. So you can build and test your web app in our cloud-based dev environment. And then once you're ready to actually run it for your end users, there's a one-click deploy process that will push everything from a cloud-based development environment to a cloud-based production environment and serve your clients. So Gadget is where you build your app, where you host your app, and where you manage and grow your app all in one. The Gadget stack looks like this today. So again, just to reinforce everything, first of all, we host everything on Google Cloud. So everything from the database to the runtime is on GCP. We use Google Cloud Storage to offer you file storage. We use Postgres as our database, which we will manage and scale and index for you. So Postgres is your database when you're storing data. File storage comes from GCP, Google Cloud, as I mentioned. We layer on top of that a set of capabilities through our framework, which I'll show you: instant CRUD API generation and documentation, the ability to run serverless functions that allow you to do custom logic beyond just create, read, update, and delete, which is CRUD. And then finally, kind of Gadget's special sauce is, because everything is serverless live, you have a back end and a front end. We actually have the ability to instantly connect that back end to third-party APIs. And so today there is a built-in integration to Shopify. We plan on adding many more. And that lets you sync data, react to webhooks, do OAuth against third parties in an almost no-code or very, very low-code way, which I'll show you in a moment. So this is your Gadget stack. All these pieces are set up for you when we give you a project and you start kind of building. So let's start looking at what a Gadget app looks like. I've created one before this call started. I called it Some Blog Backend, because I'm going to use the analogy of a blog's backend to kind of show you some of the pieces of Gadget. Before we get to that example, let's just talk about the interface. So everything is in the web, as you can see. When you are writing code in Gadget, I will be using the web editor, but you'll actually have a one-line command that's always available to you at the bottom of your editor here under what we call file sync. If you run this command in your terminal, every code file that you see in the Gadget web editor will be synchronized with your local computer. So if you want to use your VS Code with your fancy linters and keyboard shortcuts, you just run this command, synchronize the Gadget project with your local computer, and use your preferred text editor to code, and all of the latest changes will be automatically synchronized with Gadget. For this demo, I am going to use the web editor exclusively. I'm not going to use VS Code just because it's a little bit faster, but I wanted to call out that you'll see me use the web editor. You have the option of using a text editor when you're writing code. The next thing I'll talk about a little bit is just kind of the interface. So like right now, I have a Postgres database, a Node.js backend, and a React front end, and all of this is live on the internet as we speak. So Gadget actually gives me two URLs, one representing development. You can see the URL is just some blog backend -- development. And then I have a production URL just called some blog backend. The idea is I'm building on the development URL, and then I'm deploying to the production URL when I'm ready. And you can click on these and go inspect them. These are live on the internet. So right now, Gadget's just setting up because this is a new project. It might take a little while. But once that's up and running, this URL will actually serve a user interface that you can interact with. So React on the front end, and you can see there's a little front end folder that we set up for you. It has React installed. It uses technology called Vite under the hood, which is really fancy and gives you access to some plugins as well. And everything is serverless and instantly live. So as you make changes in your files, they will be served on that URL in real time. There is no deploy process. It's hot module reloading, except it's not on localhost. It's on an internet URL. The backend is also fully set up for me. So I have my Postgres database. I have my Node.js runtime. And so if I were to build the back end of a blog, what I would probably start with is two parts. I need a table to store some data. I need some data around the authors of my blog and maybe the blog posts themselves. And then I need an API to kind of update, create, delete blog posts, change authors. And I would go build a front end using that API to talk to my back end. How would I do this in Gadget? Let's start talking the framework. So the first concept, and probably the most important one that you will use the most often, is the Gadget action framework. So the way it works is we have a concept called models, very similar to Ruby on Rails kind of active model. You add a model just by clicking this button. And what we instantly produce behind the scenes, and this is documented in your API, which I'll show you in a moment, is a table in Postgres that is ready to be shaped by you via these fields, and 3 API endpoints that allow you to create, update, and delete records in this table. And both of these are live as we speak, and they will edit themselves as I make edits in this user interface. So right now there's a table in Postgres that just has 3 fields, an ID field and 2 timestamps. That's pretty useless. Let's add a couple more fields. Let's say, first of all, I'm going to call the model post. Sorry, I forgot to do that. Let's just give the model a name because I want to store my blog posts here. And then what I'll do is I'll give the table itself, the Postgres table, a field called title. I can give it some types. We have lots of types to choose from. I can give it custom validations in JavaScript or regex, or just GUI validations like requiredness or string length. I won't do any of that right now, but I just wanted to show you that all those capabilities are there. And Gadget will run these validations before you commit data to your database and will return any error messages it needs to return to the end user. Let me add another field to my blog post table. A title is not enough. Let's say there's also a body. So I added 2 fields to a Postgres table. What's actually happening behind the scenes? Let's look at my API reference. I'm going to click here. And I want to show you folks a few things. One, this is my API. You can see it shares the name of my project. And that is because every single project gets its own full set of API documentation. The API documentation covers Gadget's kind of general installing instructions and how the API works. But then it also generates documents and productionizes your API endpoint. So you can see down here, there's a schema for this thing called post, which just happens to be the model I created in Gadget. And if I click on it, there's a full set of documentation for how to retrieve a post from my backend, find one, find many, search, filter, paginate, create, update, and delete. All of these API endpoints, even though I am in development, are live in the cloud. They just happen to be pointed to a development URL that Gadget gave me, but they are very, very real and live on the internet. And so you can test them right away. So you could go to post create, and actually I'll show you through the product because it's a little bit nicer. You click on the create action. These are the 3 API endpoints we auto generate for you. You can kind of create more yourself as well should you need them. We show you how the framework works, which I'll get to in a moment, but you can actually just kind of test the CRUD API instantly. This is a GraphQL playground that we offer you. And this is because your API is GraphQL, but on top of that, there's a JavaScript and React client. So usually use JS or React, but when I'm testing, I just use the GraphQL playground. We'll add a JS playground in a moment as well. So what I can do is I could quickly say, well, I want to create a blog post with these variables, and I'm just passing the variables in the bottom here. This is the actual GraphQL mutation that's required. So we'll say some blog post with a title called some title and a body called some body. If I hit this play button, an API call is actually going to get made against my endpoint, and you can see success true, a record got created. And if I go back to Gadget, there's actually a table as well for every model, and I can see the record in real time. So what I did was I created a model called post. Instantly, an empty Postgres database was created for me by Gadget in the cloud, hosted, auto-scaled by Gadget. I gave it a couple of fields. I said, well, every blog post needs a title and a body. Instantly, the API to talk to my backend was updated to allow for these additional query parameters. And then I tested my API endpoint very, very quickly in a GraphQL playground. And I noticed that it worked. It created a blog post with some title, some body. Very simple example to start. So far, all I've done is I've shown you the Gadget model concept. So you add a model up here by clicking this button. We give you a Postgres table and an API for populating that table. You shape the table, the API instantly updates. you can consume that API at any point in time in development, and you can deploy that API to production with one click. That is kind of the high level mental model of how models and actions work. Now, these actions can be extended. You're looking at a lot of stuff on this page that I'm ignoring. I'll show you how to extend an action using custom code in a moment. Before I do that, I want to make this a little bit more real. If I were building the back end of a blog, what I would probably have as well is some concept for authors. So I'll do the model and action run through again. I'll create another table. I'll call it author. I'll say every author has, first name, last name, maybe an email, and let's say a phone number. Again, I probably wouldn't leave all of these as strings, but for now, for this example, I'm just going to leave the types as strings. If I go to my API reference again, I can see now there's a whole author schema instantly generated. If I go to the author schema, I can search, find, create, update, delete, similar to the blog post schema. I can instantly look at mutations. I have a JavaScript and a React client that I can use. So Gadget tells me what the JavaScript and React calls should look like. For GraphQL, though, we have this kind of handy playground that you can open instantly and, again, test your endpoints. Before I do this with the author post, I actually want to create a relationship. So I want to show you one more concept in Gadget, which is this is a relational database that you're using behind the scenes. Probably many of you are familiar with NoSQL versus SQL databases. Postgres is a SQL database. It is relational. You have to specify the nature of relationships between tables. Usually that involves a lot of boilerplate work around foreign keys and setting them up and making sure you have the IDs in the right table. The way you create a relationship between author and post in Gadget is using a very high level visual ORM that handles a lot of that work for you. So what you do is you add a field and you say, in my GraphQL schema for author, there's going to be this object that stores all of the blog posts that an author has. And then instead of picking a data type, you just scroll down to Gadget's relationship types. We use Ruby on Rails language, but this is well documented in our guides. What you would do in this example is a blog post's author has many, and then the children are the blog posts themselves. So every author has many blog posts. And then you can set up the inverse in Gadget as well in real time. So what I can do is I can quickly right here say, at the same time, let's inject an author object, my post model, and Gadget will set up all the foreign keys in both of these tables for me. So what actually happened is we represent the foreign keys as a object field, this one over here. And similarly in the post model, there's an object kind of that's storing the information about the author. And Gadget sets up the IDs to relate those things to each other. So now you have a relationship between author and post set up for you in real time. And again, the Gadget API instantly updates itself to recognize that now when you want to create a post or an author, you might actually link a related record at the same time. So let's go do that. Let me go create an author first without creating a post, and then I'll go link a post to an author. So I'll go to my author documentation, go to author create. I usually just go straight to GraphQL. I know a lot of folks are not familiar with GraphQL. We are going to add REST at some point as well. Hoping that with our auto-generated GraphQL mutations, though, it's easy enough to use. So let's create an author. We'll say the author is me. So I'm just going to punch in my information. I'm going to use a real phone number because I'm actually going to show you folks how to wire things up to other third-party APIs. And I'm going to use the example of Twilio. I'm going to start sending SMSs back and forth. And for my email, we'll use my actual email. This will create an author. And that should return a success. Yeah, that's perfect. If we go to Gadget, the author table now has an author. Let me create a blog post and link it to an author this time. So right now I have no blog posts in my blog post table. I'm going to go test this action and create a new blog post, say title, some title, body, some body, and then in GraphQL, if you're trying to simultaneously link to a record from another table, you use this fancy, whoops, got the syntax wrong. I always do. Give me 1 second. Just gonna fix this real quick. There you go. So title is some title, body, some body, and then author. I know I have an author in my author table with ID 1. That's me. I'm just going to link this blog post to that author so that it's related to that author. Sorry, I have too many windows open and I need to clean things up a tiny bit. So I should be able to run this. And it worked. And if I go back to Gadget again, I can see in my blog post table, there's a blog post, but this time it's related to author number 1, and author number 1 is me. Great. So far, the only thing I've explained is the model action framework in Gadget. Most of your work is done up here. You define tables, you get CRUD APIs, you can add your own custom API endpoints. You never write your own route handler to controller mapping for your API endpoints. We produce them for you. And then what happens when these actions are run is they actually follow a framework of their own. So I want to explain that next. By default, the create, update, and delete actions that we give you in any table have a definition. And that definition is broken into 3 parts: triggers, permissions, and effects. When you make a call to your API endpoints, you trigger them. And there are many ways to trigger an endpoint in Gadget. One of the ways is to call your own API. So right now I can see the create action only has 1 trigger, and it is me making an API call to my own endpoint. And that makes sense. My front end is probably going to call this endpoint on the back end, and it's going to create an author. I could have other triggers as well. Right now in this model, it doesn't make sense to add any more, but when we get to the Shopify connection, I'll show you that webhooks are often a trigger, for example. We also have this concept of global actions, and in there, schedulers are a trigger. So you can trigger your API endpoints by making API calls. You can trigger them on a schedule. You can trigger them by having a webhook come in and them reacting to it. All of that is possible. In this action, the only trigger is my public API that Gadget produced for me. So that's the first concept within the action framework, is the answer to when the action can actually run. The action can only run when my API is invoked in this example. Then there are permissions. So when your API makes that API call, the first thing we check is who is making the API call and are they allowed to. By default, Gadget will instantly produce roles and permissions for all of your API endpoints that you create under data models. So when I created the post table and the author table, I did not define my own access control by writing a bunch of code. Gadget actually produced the access control for me. And what I decide is which roles, which I'm going to grant to my API keys, I'll show you in a moment, have which permissions. So I can decide, a writer maybe isn't allowed to create a blog post. I probably wouldn't do that, but I could. I could also add filters that define additional logic, that maybe a writer is only allowed to update their own blog posts. I would add a filter that probably says, if it's not a blog post you created, you can't edit it. So there is complex access control functionality available to you as well under these filters. But the on or off permission set is automatically produced by Gadget. The way these roles work is that you generate API keys for your backend API. We give you two by default, reader, writer. We grant them the reader and writer role. And then these API keys follow the permissions that are granted under the role. So your backend produces a clean API that we document for you. The API has endpoints that have access control implemented by Gadget. You decide which API key has which role and which role has which permission. And when we go back to the action framework, when you make the API call to create an author, we will check those permissions to make sure that the key that is making the call, or the requester, because it's not always an API call. Like I said, it could be a scheduler, could be a webhook. We just make sure that the requester is actually allowed to make that request. And that's what we call permissions. And then finally, effects are the what. What happens when my API endpoint is actually allowed to run? Some of these are little cards that we show you in our user interface. So right now, what happens when I make an API call to create an author with a bunch of parameters specified by these fields? Well, what Gadget does is it applies the field params to a record and it saves a record to a database. It doesn't do anything else. That's how this happened. That's how I created this record. Gadget just did what it said it would do. But what's neat about this framework is that I can hook off of it and I can actually run my own logic as well. So I can say, hey, you know what? When we create a blog post, for example, let's not just take some parameters like a title and a body and save it to a database. Let's send an SMS to my boss, letting him know that a new blog post was added to the blog. How would we do this in Gadget? You add a code snippet. And again, all of these files are available in your file folder system. So the way it shows up is this file is post/create/onCreate success, because it's going to run after we finish our database work on success. And it lives in a folder called post under another folder called create. And there's the file. And you can change the files and folders. You can add util folders yourself. We just have a default convention that we offer you just to kind of get you started. This is a Node.js file. It is live. Anything I do will actually run when the next API call in development is made. I'm not going to write a lot of code in front of you folks because we're running behind a little bit on time and I want to speed things up. So what I'm going to do instead is dreadfully copy paste a bunch of code in front of you and walk you through it, just because it's a little bit faster. So let's go through what I just added here in code. So what I'm trying to teach Gadget is once the blog post is created successfully, send an SMS using Twilio. Line 5 is in every Gadget action effect file. And what it is it's basically the module export that gives you access to all of your Gadget backend. So if ever from this file you want to go inspect the author, you can do api.author.findMany with an ID filter. If ever you want to look at the record of the blog post that you're interacting with, you just look in the record object. Params, you can look at the query params that come in with the GraphQL API call. You can do console logs. We have a logger built in for both development and production. I'll show you in a moment. Your logs will show up here. And then config includes a bunch of kind of meta Gadget information that sometimes you will need access to. Going down to line 7 through 10, I'm trying to use the Twilio NPM package, and I have a couple of environment variables, an account SID and an auth token, that I don't seem to be comfortable putting in my code file for good reason, because that's insecure. So what I need to do is install Twilio, and I need to save some of these environment variables. Again, I can do all of this in Gadget. So to install Twilio, I just hit Command P, command palette shows up. I'll do yarn install Twilio. Gadget will go off and install the latest version of Twilio for me. And this is going to run in a moment or two, and we'll wait for it and come back in a second. Oops, actually, yeah, there we go. It's running. There's a second way to install NPM packages. Sorry, this X erroring out will probably go away in a second. Oh, I had a typo, I think. Something wrong. There we go. This will install Twilio for me. This is going to install the latest version of Twilio. I also have a package.json file, and I can actually inject a line here that says Twilio with a specific version. I'm not going to do that because this file is trying to install the latest version for me. And there you go. So Twilio 4.11.0 was installed. Okay, great. I got Twilio. I need my environment variables. For environment variables, I go down to settings. Down here, environment variables, and I just kind of add variables. And I believe they were called Twilio account SID and Twilio auth token. So I'll quickly add those in. Twilio account. And you folks can quickly take screenshots and try to run up my Twilio account after this this demo. And I'm going to quickly try to rotate my API keys after this demo so that nothing goes wrong. My phone number, my Twilio phone number in that code file was also a variable. So I'm just adding that in. And then I need to add one last one, which is the actual auth token. You can encrypt these as well just by clicking this button, should you not want to show the values to any of your colleagues. In my case, like I said, I'm going to rotate these keys afterward, so not a big deal. And I'm not going to bother putting in production credentials, so I'm only putting in development for now. I'm showing you everything in development, so it doesn't really matter. Let's go back to the file of code. It was under create on success. And let's go through the rest of it. So line 8 and 9 is they're going to fetch the environment variables that I just added to my environment variables page. Let's go through line 14 to 25. So we're using the Gadget API here. And what we're doing is declaring a constant and going and fetching the author that corresponds to this blog post. So what I do is await.api. So I'm going into the Gadget API now. And I'm using the auto-generated API endpoints. One of them is author.findFirst, and I'm trying to find the author that shares the ID with my blog post, so that I can then send the SMS. And I'm fetching the first name, last name, and phone number of that author from the author table using the API object Gadget gives me. And then finally, line 29 through 37 is me actually sending the SMS using the Twilio client. So I won't bother going through this in detail because this is about Twilio's API, but I just kind of declare a message and I use the phone number and I send fairly static with the exception of my name. Hello, Mohammed. This is a message sent from Gadget backend using Twilio. And I do a logger.info, which is our version of a fancy console log. You can do console log as well, but with logger.info, you can pass in some dynamic data, which is really nice. And this will show up in my logs. So now what's happened is as soon as I'm done with this file of code, my development environment and my API for my development environment once again are updated. And the newest version of the API, if I were to use it, would run this file. So if I go to post, create, and I test action, this time around, my expectation is that I will get an SMS on my phone because it is going to send an SMS to the author of the blog post saying, hey, you successfully created a blog post. So let's test that out. We'll do some title. Body again, we'll do some body. I'm really not great at GraphQL. And so every time I want to link a blog post to an author, I need a little bit of help, and that's what it looks like. So I'm creating a new blog post, some title, some body, linking it to author number 1, which was myself. And this time around, what's going to happen when I run this action is Gadget is first going to apply the field params to the record, create and save the record to the database, and run this file that sends an SMS via Twilio. And if we look at my phone, which will be really, really hard to see, that second SMS just arrived from Twilio. And so I got the SMS from Twilio. It says, "Hello, Mohammed. This is a message sent from a Gadget backend using Twilio." So very, very live. The API is constantly being regenerated for you based on how you instruct us to shape it. And you can customize what it does using these effects by changing triggers, by changing permissions. That is how actions work in Gadget. So actions are a very, very important concept. Models and actions, you create a table, you get CRUD actions instantly. You can extend those CRUD actions to do whatever you like. There are more advanced features as well hidden under all these icons that you may or may not need depending on the nature of your project. But this basic loop that I showed you is one that you'll run through constantly. And the advantage of Gadget here is that you can do it really, really quickly with no boilerplate infrastructure, zero setup, test it live on the internet, and then deploy it with a couple of clicks once you're done. So that is models and actions. That's one of the core concepts of Gadget. Actions have triggers, permissions, effects. Now, the second core concept I want to touch on is global actions. Actions are great in Gadget when you're manipulating a single record, an actual record in a database table. So if you're playing around with one record, you often want to use actions. Even if I wanted custom actions, like let's say I want an API endpoint for publishing blog posts, I would probably go to the post model and add an action and call it publish, and then define it using the Gadget framework. So actions are where you go when you're thinking API endpoints to manipulate individual records. Global actions, which are down here, are for when you are trying to manipulate many records, or when you're trying to not manipulate any record at all, but run some server-side logic. So for example, if I wanted to every night send an email to every single author with a summary of all the blog posts that they've created that day, I'm no longer interacting with one blog post or one author. The action framework of Gadget under models no longer works for me. I need global actions. The difference between global actions and actions is that global actions are not scoped down to a single record. They can actually interact with many records, zero, infinite, in one go. So if I were building a scheduler with email, I would come to global actions. And what I would do is I would just add an action, maybe call it, send email nightly.js. Oops, I don't think I'm supposed to do the .js. So I create an API endpoint, again, instantly documented in my API reference. And this endpoint will run whenever the Gadget API is triggered and will do whatever this code file tells it to do. What's different here, though, is I'm not tied to any record in any table. I can do whatever I like. The other really nice features of global actions versus model actions is that they have other triggers. So I can say that this action is not actually going to be triggered by my API, but rather on a scheduler. And there's a no-code kind of light scheduler built right into Gadget. So I can say, you know what, I'm not going to make API calls to run this file. Gadget should run it every day at midnight, and this is in local time, so it'll be in your local time when you're looking at it. And there's a couple of combinations of these that you can do, and Gadget will manage, own, and run this schedule for you and trigger whatever you put in this file. So that's what global actions are for. Actions are for manipulating individual records. Global actions are for manipulating collections of records or no records at all, where you just want to run some server-side logic. Beyond that distinction, Actions and global actions are identical. They have a trigger, they have permissions, they have effects. If I go to my roles and permissions page, there is one for the global action called send email nightly, and I can decide which of my API keys can actually call that action. That doesn't make a lot of sense because I decided it's not a API triggered action, but I could bring the API trigger back and say that certain keys are not allowed to make this call while other keys are allowed to make this call. They also have effects. As you can see, they don't have any built-in effects because we're not saving data to a database with them, but they give me the same capabilities. I can run my code either during the run effects or the on success effects that we give you. And these are just two levels of hook endpoints that are slightly different that I'll let you read through in our documentation. 99% of the time you use success effects. Very rarely do you ever manipulate the run effects, but there are reasons why you might want to. So again, global actions, identical to actions in almost every way, with the exception that they are not scoped to one record. Now, both actions and global actions, everything I've shown you so far, both the actions here and the global actions down here, they all follow the same framework. Frameworks are great until they're not. You'll get, from 0 to 98% of your project done really, really quickly, saving tons of time. And then there's this one weird requirement that you can't satisfy because you can't put it into the framework. So what are some examples of those? Like, for example, today Gadget only has 3 trigger types: API calls, schedulers, or webhooks from Shopify. But what if you wanted webhook from some other service to trigger some functionality server side for you? How do you do that in Gadget when there is no trigger for it? That's where we get to the third concept, HTTP routes. When actions and global actions can't get the job done, which is maybe less than 5% of your work in Gadget typically, you go down one level to a lower level concept, which is just HTTP routes. These are true serverless functions that we will run for you, but there's no framework anymore. And so they live in this routes folder down here that we give you. And we give you a little example of like a route that just serves a little bit of HTML on a page called /hello. But you can actually build your own routes. And you use routes anytime Gadget feels like it's getting in the way. 95% of your project should be up here where you're using our framework and going super fast. Sometimes you want to do something unique. You come down here, you take back control, you go a little bit slower because there's no framework anymore to help you, but you now have full control over what the serverless function does. So let's go through an example. Let's say you saw that on my phone, I got an SMS from Twilio. Twilio has webhooks. So if I respond to that SMS, Twilio will get the response. How do I map that response to Gadget? Where maybe I want to take whatever text message I type back in my phone that's going to Twilio to get to a Gadget HTTP route so that I can see the data. And maybe I want to use that data to trigger another action in Gadget. But because there is no webhook trigger for Twilio, I have to kind of build it myself. What do? Again, I'm going to paste some code really quickly in front of you folks. I have to rename the file. HTTP routes typically follow a convention that you need to use in order to specify the URL. So in my case, I'll just call this post webhooktwilio.js. Sorry, I'm just checking to see where I actually aimed my my Twilio webhooks. So I've pointed my Twilio webhooks to some blog backend.gadgetapp/webhooktwilio.js. And what I'm going to teach Gadget is when the webhook data from Twilio hits this HTTP route, just take some of the data and console log it for me. So all it's going to do is it's going to show a log in my logs that says SMS received. So again, This is all live. Moments after this code is implemented, the API for it is auto-produced by Gadget, the route is produced by Gadget, and it lives on my development URL /webhook Twilio. And my Twilio account is already wired up to this URL. I did that before we got on the call. So now what I can do is I can pick up my phone, I can open that SMS, and I can respond to it. So I'll just say, hello, everybody. Nice to see you. And Twilio is going to route this message to this HTTP route, and I should see it in my console log. So if we go to my logs, what we'll see is I have logs for development and production, and I'm not quite getting this back. So I may have done something wrong here. Live demos are great. So these are the your Gadget logs, by the way. Let me take a sec and explain what I'm looking at. So Gadget gives me logs for both development and production. I can see what's going on in each environment. And when I add console log statements to my code, they will show up here. So some of this stuff here is around me creating that record for the author. I can see this is related to the Twilio message that was sent to me, but I don't see anything related to the Twilio message that I responded with, and that is concerning. So let me go and take a look at this file, see if I did anything wrong here. We'll give this another minute. If I can't figure it out, we'll just move on. I'm gonna send another response and see if that works, because this should be working. I don't believe, yeah, unfortunately, I am not quite sure why my webhook from Twilio is not getting to this route and why it's not being console logged. I will troubleshoot this later. I want to keep moving forward because we're running out of time, and I don't want to waste your time watching me troubleshoot a bug here. But the concept still holds. So you use model actions when you're manipulating single records. You use global actions when you're manipulating a collection of records or no record at all. You almost always try to use actions or global actions when you're building a backend in Gadget. Very rarely, when Gadget doesn't have something you need, you ignore actions and global actions. You go down to HTTP routes, which is a lower level concept. It's like the escape hatch to the framework. You write your own custom serverless function. We will run it and scale it for you. And so your backend logic is always split between these three buckets. It's like, what are my models and actions? What are my global actions? What are my HTTP routes? Now, once you do all of this, you produce an API that then lets you build a front end in the Gadget React front end folder, because we give you a React client as well. Let me show you what that looks like with the example of a Shopify app, because I think that's what we're all here for. So let's delete a couple of these tables just to clean up the mess I've made in my project. We're going to ignore the whole front end example, the blog example altogether. Just going to delete some of these files to try to restore Gadget to close to its starting state. And typical Gadget project looks like this. If you're building a Shopify app, there's a few additional bells and whistles that Gadget gives you that are really, really nice, and they fall into the global action framework. So I'm going to explain what we give you on the Shopify connection side through the lens of that framework. So how does it work? Let's say I'm building an app that needs some product data, whether it's synchronizing historical products or reacting to webhooks of new products that are being added to a Shopify store. What I would do is I would connect my Gadget backend to Shopify. And this is where the serverless nature of Gadget really comes in handy, because you're doing all of this in a test environment. Hopefully you have a test store in your Shopify partners dashboard, which is what you're looking at here. But you're doing it live on the internet. This is not local host. What will happen in production is exactly what's going to happen in development because the two are served from the same infrastructure. So I just create a new project in Shopify's partner portal. I'll do a simple product app. And I'll get my API keys from Shopify. And I'll plug them into Gadget. And I will go and grab the read and write scopes for products. So what Gadget is showing me on this page is all of Shopify's admin API scopes. The entire admin API until 2023-04 should be here. And we are always up to date with the latest versions, usually with a 1 week delay. So once they introduce 2023-07, a week later, we'll have it available for you. What you do is you specify the scopes you need to power your app. So I need to read and write products. So I'll say read and write products. But then what Gadget is going to try to do is to explain to you in the Gadget framework what's going to be set up. So we ask you that, or we tell you that the data underneath this scope populates many tables. There are many resources in Shopify that get populated by this one scope. Which of these tables do you actually care about? And I'll say I care about the product and the product image maybe, and nothing else. And I'll hit confirm. And now what Gadget is going to do is it's going to set up all the models and actions similar to that framework I showed you for the blog post, but it's auto set up for me. So it gave me a bunch of tables. The two that are most interesting are Shopify product and product image. Let's start there. So what ended up happening is Gadget created a model, which is a table with all of the fields that match the Shopify resource called product, with all the validations and types built in. So this table is a direct mimic of Shopify's product resource according to their latest API version. And we also instantly gave you the same 3 create, update, delete actions that we give you similar to the blog post example. But what's different here is that while they follow the same framework of triggers, permissions, and effects, the triggers are different. The triggers are a Shopify webhook or me synchronizing historical data, not my GraphQL API endpoint. I can add a GraphQL API endpoint as well. It doesn't really make sense because I actually want this action to react to events from Shopify. And that's really what Gadget is trying to tell me is like by default, this action is going to react to events from Shopify. And then what is it going to do? It's going to run the effects similar to what we did with our blog example. It's going to take some data that comes in through the API. This is just a little bit of tenancy that we handle for you. If you're building a public app, you never want to mistakenly put the wrong data or give access to the wrong data to the wrong store. All of access control and tenancy is handled by us automatically. So we make sure that only the people who are out to read and write to certain tables can do so. And then finally, we save the record. So similar to my blog example, we just take whatever came into the API, we save a record. But again, similar to my example, you can run effects. So if you wanted to do something fancy where whenever someone edits a blog post, a product description, maybe you check to make sure there's no typos. You could run a really simple file of code down here that goes through record.body, because the record is the Shopify product that we're getting a webhook for, inspects its body, and looks at the words and sees if there's any words that are misspelled and corrects them. And you could do all of that in this one file and then deploy this app, and this app would work in production. So the Gadget framework applies to the Shopify connection. What we just do is we accelerate it for you by setting all of the tables in your Postgres database, your API endpoints, documenting it all, and wiring it all up for you and getting it ready for you to customize. So all you got to do to finish this off, we're going to run over time a little bit. I apologize, but I want to make sure some of these concepts are understood to you folks as we go into the hackathon. So I take my Gadget development URLs. These are for my development environment. You can see it's the one that says / development. And I punch them into Shopify. And I save. And now I'm ready to test out the connection. So I can actually go and install this application on one of my development stores. I have one with a lot of products. Whether the app is a custom app or a public, token not valid for this app. Why? Oh, I know what I did. This is really unfortunate. I'm going to restart a project instead of trying to take over my blog backend. Let me just do that really quickly again. I apologize. I should have prepared for this a little bit better up front. Two projects ready for you folks, one Shopify, one blog, and not mix them up together. But I mixed them up together, and now it's creating some problems. So let's just go and take the same API keys I created. And let's grab the product scopes again. Let's set up all the tables in Gadget. Let's grab my new URLs. So this app has slightly different URLs from the blog one that I was showing a moment ago. My new development URLs. Let's stick these in here. And now let's go and install on a test store. Before I do that, yep, Gadget is fully set up. So whether you're installing a custom app for one merchant or a public app from the App Store, the OAuth page is produced, managed by us. So it would show your partner name. Like I created this through the Gadget partner dashboard, but this would normally show your name. And these are the scopes that you request. So I requested products and collections. Once I install, something really interesting happens. I'm taken to an embedded user interface inside the Shopify admin. And the embedded user interface is powered by a Gadget file. So this is actually a UI that is produced by this file in my front end folder. So in my front end folder, after connecting to Shopify, I have shoppage.jsx. It is producing this embedded admin UI. This embedded admin UI follows Shopify's content security policy headers. If we do tenancy checks, so we make sure you're never showing the wrong data to the wrong shop if you're doing a public app. It has Polaris installed, and it has your Gadget backend API installed. So whatever backend API actions you generate are instantly available to play with on the front end. And it has hot module loading as well. So even though this is live on the internet on a development store, I can go to this file and just have a little bit of fun with it and change maybe some of this static copy to hello world. And without actually refreshing this page, I can see that it is updating to react to what I change in my file. And again, if I were to do code editing from VS Code or Sublime by running this terminal command, the same thing would happen. You would make changes in VS Code, and the live development URL would instantly update to serve the latest version of your front end. So that's kind of one of the niceties of the Shopify connection is, first of all, we set up the models for you, the tables, so that you have webhook processing. I'll show you that in a second. Secondly, we set up the front end folder for you so that you have an embedded admin app right out of the gate that you can just start editing with zero setup. Let's go back to the back end, the webhooks and the syncing, these triggers that we talked about. Right now, if I go and create a product in the store, Gadget will find out about the product, and it will create a product in the product table by running this action. It's going to take the Shopify webhook trigger, and it's going to run these effects. So let's test that out. Let's just do test product. think the only thing that's required is the title and the description. When I hit save, this webhook fires to Gadget. I'm going to go to the logs again just to show you the logs when they're actually working. So you can see in real time what's happening in your development environment. A webhook hit our server. I can even look at the webhook payload directly in Gadget, and I can see Gadget just created a record. And if I go to that table, the record is there. So I'm reacting to webhooks, which is great. And I can do more by teaching Gadget to do more by running Node.js serverless functions for me. I'm not going to do that. I want to show you syncing, because not everything is about data in the future. Webhooks are about data in the future, right? Some future event that you react to. What about data from the past? Often for Shopify apps, you need historical data to power your user interface. You need products, product images. You need some of this from the admin API, and it is very, very hard to get large sets of data from Shopify's admin API because of their rate limits. Gadget gives you an API endpoint called sync, which is documented in your API. It's down here, the sync API. And you can, from your front end or your back end, at any point in time with one API call, tell Gadget to synchronize historical data for any of your Shopify tables, for any merchant, for any date range. So you can see there's some parameters that you can pass. So you can say, hey, sync this specific model, or only this specific date range, or only this specific merchant URL. Because you want to limit the data you synchronize so that you don't pay too much for it. You are going to pay for data storage. You want to sync the limited data set that you need. You run this API action either from your front end in the front end folder or from one of the Gadget actions server side. And you can teach Gadget, go and synchronize all the products in the store. Now, I'm not going to do this because it takes a little bit of time to just type up that little code file for me. If you're doing a custom app, what's neat is in the Gadget UI, you can actually go to any store that installs your app and run it via a click of a button. I'm going to do it this way. When I hit this button, Gadget will run a long-running background job that'll go fetch all the data in the product and product image table, and it'll bring it to these two tables. So if I open these tables now, there should be hundreds and hundreds of products, all of my inventory from Shopify synchronized with Gadget. And this is one API call that's 2 lines long from your front end or your back end. You never have to deal with Shopify's rate limits again. The last feature the Shopify connection gives you is one global action called Global Shopify Sync. This runs daily. We're going to change this to show you the scheduler on which it runs. All this does is it checks all the records in all of your tables and it makes sure they're up to date. Webhooks are flimsy. Shopify doesn't fire them sometimes. Your server might not receive them. Things go wrong. Computers go down for split seconds. You can't just rely on webhooks, never. To build e-commerce, when you're dealing with people's money, you need to make sure that you got the webhook. So what we do is every single day, we go through every single ID for the last 24 hours, and we make sure we didn't miss a webhook. And if we miss the webhook, we run your action again. So if we miss a product create webhook that night, we will run the product create on that record. And so at most, ideally, you are never out of sync. And if you are out of sync by one webhook, within 24 hours, Gadget will self-correct. So that's what the Shopify connection gives you. It gives you models and actions that represent and let you hook off of events from Shopify. It gives you a global action that makes sure the data is always in sync. And it gives you a front end that is already serving with zero setup, a React embedded admin UI down here, powered by a file of code in Gadget that I can edit anytime to start building my front end. And what I do in Gadget is I take my Shopify data, I blend in my custom tables, I get my backend API, and then I go into the front end folder and I start building my front end using the Gadget React API client that's produced. And that is how I build Shopify apps. Backend first, personally, get my API, go build a front end. And that's generally just how I think. Some people prefer front end to back. That's also possible as well. Gadget is a bit faster if you go back to front. I'm going to pause here. We're over time. There's a lot of questions in the Q&A. I want to try to cover those in the next 10 minutes. If there are any questions that are not previously submitted through the Q&A, I see you folks have been doing it. Thank you, Emma, for letting everyone know. It's posting questions in the chat, and I'll cover them as well if I can. So let's start with the submitted ones first. I'm going to read them, and I'm going to answer them one by one. Sorry, I'm just pulling these up. Okay, so are there currently any known limitations to using Gadget for building Shopify interfaces? At the moment, we have not seen a project that has hit any limitations they can't complete. Part of it is the escape hatch we give you on the back end. You have HTTP routes. That's exactly what they're there for. When you hit a limitation, you take back control and you just build a serverless function. And on the front end, it's true React. So the embedded admin UI is just a React file that is just using the latest version of React, and you can do whatever you like on it. So to date, we have not seen anything that suggests you can't build your app in Gadget. I want to show you folks 2 examples of complex public apps that are out there in the App Store. So let's just go to the Shopify App Store to give you a sense of how much complexity you can handle with Gadget, and that it's not just for simple automations. So Showday, which is a live QVC app. So there's like a video player on a store. Someone's talking about a product. You can click, go buy it. There's analytics. This application is powered by Gadget. You can build something this sophisticated in Gadget, where a merchant can produce videos, sell products, link to checkout, do a one-click buy, and even have analytics all built into the Shopify app. Auto is another really good example. It's an automated product and blog post content generator. This was actually built in Gadget in 6 or 7 days end to end. And I mean, from the moment the Gadget project was started to submitted to the Shopify App Store. So it has a user interface, an embedded admin UI. It has an API. It's reacting to webhooks. It's making calls to OpenAI. It's polling OpenAI because it uses ChatGPT's APIs. It sends data back to Shopify. All of this built in Gadget in 6-7 days as well, just using our framework and the fact that everything is zero setup and automatically connected. So you can take these concepts I've shown you, and I'm silly for not having shared my screen while doing that. This was Auto. This was Showday, the other one that I was talking about. So you can go to the App Store and look at some of these apps. We're going to have a built with Gadget page on our website soon, so you can see what else is built in Gadget, but you can do quite a lot of complexity. And to date, we have not seen anyone hit any limitations. Moving forward, second question. How do you create a theme app extension app block using Gadget from start to finish? Okay, great. Unfortunately, I don't have time to show you. I really do want to do another session where I just build apps, and I'll talk to Emma about maybe sending an email to all of you folks to do another one next week where I'll just build 2 or 3 apps in front of you. But the way you build a theme app extension, a checkout extension, or a Shopify function using Gadget is always the same. You need to submit the extension using Shopify CLI. So the user interface of the extension, you open up Shopify CLI, you create the file, and you use the Shopify CLI to submit that to Shopify. And the reason you do that through Shopify CLI always is because they let you preview what you're doing through their interface with that weird pop-up that they have. I'm not quite sure what to call it. You get to preview what you're doing. And then once you're done submitting the interface, just the interface, everything else you do in Gadget, just as I described. You connect the API keys to a Gadget project. OAuth is handled by Gadget, session tokens, scope management, API versioning, all of that handled by Gadget. But the submission of the actual extension, whether it's a theme app extension, checkout extension, Shopify function, always through the Shopify CLI, just because you get to preview it through there. So we have a tutorial on a checkout extension on our website that you should take a look at, because it follows the same steps. You'll see my colleague Riley submits the checkout extension through Shopify CLI and then goes and builds the whole server side that is communicating with that extension through Gadget. You would use that same breakdown for building a theme app extension. I'll see if Riley can prioritize doing a quick tutorial on theme app extensions at some point. And like I said, I'll do a follow-up for a build session where I'll actually build a theme app extension in front of you in a few minutes, because it's pretty easy. But it is doable, yes. Next question. How would I bring marketplace data in a Gadget app and map it with existing Shopify products or create new products on Shopify? Probably, so I'm imagining what you're asking here is you have a marketplace that you're trying to connect to Shopify. And when a product is created in that marketplace, maybe you want to also create it in Shopify as well. So in this case, in the Gadget framework, there is a missing trigger, right? The marketplace is the source of truth. When a product is created in the marketplace, I want to do something in Gadget. So immediately I'm like, okay, Gadget doesn't have a trigger for my marketplace. I can't use actions. I can't use global actions. I go straight to routes. And what I would start doing, and I'll comment this out really quickly, is I'll probably have, some route that's, let me just comment it out, taking in data from marketplace events. These are either coming in as webhooks from the marketplace or API calls, because you can just make an API call to this route with data. And then probably sending data to Shopify. And in this example, I would not use any of the models, because all you're doing is writing to Shopify. You probably don't care that much about the reads and the webhooks and the syncing. Maybe you do, maybe for reconciliation. But I would just write the lines of code right here to make that API call to Shopify. And the way it works is we give you an object called connections in every file. And connections is what connects you to Shopify. So you do connections.current. That fetches the current shop, and then you can write anything to that shop by making API calls directly. So that's how I would build the marketplace to Shopify connector, is through a HTTP route that takes the data from the marketplace and then sends it to Shopify. If it was Shopify to marketplace, I would use an action, because Gadget already has the webhook triggers and everything built in. Next question. How to use Gadget to build large-scale Shopify apps? Can Gadget prove itself as a strong app development framework? So I think it's a great question, one you should ask of any young company. I'll say this at risk of sounding a little boastful. My co-founder and I were both executives at Shopify for many years. We ran Shopify's financial services infrastructure, as well as Shopify Checkout. Shopify Checkout handles volume at a monumental scale compared to anything we're doing at Gadget yet. And so hopefully, if you could trust us to scale the checkout that's serving 3 million merchants and all their customers at the same time, you can trust us to scale your backend and your database. And the framework we use at Gadget is very, very similar to how we used to scale infrastructure at Shopify. Shopify also has one giant shared database for the vast majority of its merchant data that it's kind of scaling in the serverless way. A lot of the concepts we've used in the past. So we feel quite confident that they can scale. And I'll also mention that the two apps I showed you in the App Store, even though we've only had public app support for about 4 months, some of these apps have thousands of merchants installing them. Gadget has already processed hundreds of millions of webhooks, and we're soon nearing 1 billion webhooks as well. So we've seen enough scale to feel quite confident that we can keep pushing this up for you folks. And if it helps, again, the CEO of Shopify, Toby Luca, and the president are also investors. They're very bought into the product. They played with it. They believe in it. They trust the infrastructure. So it's also a product that's endorsed by executives at Shopify. Question number 5. I'm new to Gadget, but I know Shopify. How can I use my experience as a software dev and Shopify dev to Gadget platform? So that's a really good one. And I think this is where we're coming up a little bit short. Like, we're almost like burdening the developer with too many of our ways of doing things. And we feel quite confident that if you accept and learn our way, you will finish your project probably 50 to 70% faster, therefore make a lot more money. But we are actively working on simplifying the product further to make it easier for someone who comes from, let's say, a Rails background and has already built a Shopify app to figure out like how to map their Rails understanding of the world to a Gadget understanding. We don't have enough documentation around how to migrate apps from different stacks to Gadget yet. We'll be adding those as well. My suggestion is always newbie to Gadget. There is one canonical tutorial that's in our tutorial list called the product tagger. Complete the product tagger tutorial end to end. It touches actions, it touches global actions, it serves an embedded UI, it's connected to Shopify. It touches a lot of the concepts we talked about today, and it only takes an hour and a half. My suggestion would be, if you're new to Gadget, do the product tagger tutorial end to end. Question number 6, setting up queues within Gadget. You've been using Heroku and Redis for Shopify apps. You're curious what the best tools for this stack are. I'm going to assume what you mean by queues is like a queue for running a background job, like retry logic and all of that. Very, very good question. It's actually a missing concept in Gadget right now. So let's say I wanted to connect Shopify. The data is coming from Shopify to an inventory system. And let's say I'm going to synchronize a lot of data really quickly, because the Gadget gives me the sync API. I'm going to teach Gadget, go fetch every single product and send it to this inventory system for me in real time. What'll happen is that'll probably fail. And why will it fail? Because Gadget fetches data from Shopify very, very quickly as the Shopify API rate limits allow. And so you saw in my demo how quickly I got hundreds of product records. If you try sending those hundreds of product records synchronously to the order management system or the inventory management system, there's a very good chance that API will rate limit you and crash, or tell you that you're trying to write too much too fast. And so you need a queue, or you need some sort of like background job that can pace the data between Shopify and Marketplace. Within the Gadget stack, we don't have this concept yet. We're going to add background jobs and queuing in Q3. So there will be a native queuing feature in Gadget soon. In the meantime, my recommendation is Google Cloud Tasks. Google Cloud Tasks give you this really easy API accessible no-code queue builder. So whenever I'm building a connector from Shopify to a marketplace and I'm going to send, let's say, 50,000 records in one go, what I do is I actually teach Gadget to take the webhook, send it to Google Cloud Tasks. I go to my Google Cloud console and I just create a little queue, and it's very no code. You can actually just set all the parameters for the retry logic and at what pace it should send the data without writing any code. Gadget sends the data to Google Cloud Tasks. Google Cloud Tasks sends the data to my end destination. And that's how I slow Gadget down and build a queue today. There are libraries. Again, Gadget is a Node.js backend, so I'm sure there's like 50 libraries for different queue systems you can use in that are free as well. Google Cloud Tasks is very much free for a very generous amount of time. So that's my default recommendation. If you want to queue in Gadget quickly, Google Cloud Tasks. Next question. What are things and features apart from the demo covering product recommendations? And can we have an end-to-end tutorial that shows all of this? So there are some end-to-end tutorials, and there are some forkable apps. Let me just show you how to find them. I'm going to share my screen one more time. If you go to the Gadget website, you can actually go to this page called templates. And any of these sample apps for which there are tutorials, you can go and read the tutorial, follow along, build it yourself. And my recommendation, like I said earlier, is to definitely do this tutorial, the automated product tagger. Or you can click this button and we will instantly create a full copy of that application live on a URL for you in your Gadget admin. So I'll just give the project a name. Let's say my tagging sample app. Gadget will instantly give me the entire product tagger app, all of its code files, all of its models, all of its package.json. I probably need to run yarn install. But this app is actually fully built. It has a front end, it has a back end. I can go through it, look at Gadget's logic. I can read the tutorial and see how it was put together. And I can do this for many, many examples just by going to Gadget.dev/templates. So you can find the tutorial if you prefer to read and follow along, or you can just fork it and look around and see what we did. Okay, moving forward to the next question, because they keep on coming. This is great, by the way. What is the pricing model of Gadget and what is the most suitable plan? Okay, let's just do this one really quickly. Pricing's pretty simple. Everything is cloud-based. You have a free tier. So let's go to Gadget.dev/pricing. This is going to change. We're introducing one more plan between team and enterprise, mostly for agencies that do lots of projects. The idea here is typically a developer that's building public apps, like a solopreneur, starts on a hobby plan, plays with Gadget, builds confidence, probably even gets their app to production. You can usually get a couple of merchants to even install it and run some data without running over any of the hosting we give you for free. So this is the free plan. This is the hosting broken down by request time, data storage, and all the different components. And we give you this much for free. But if you ever exceed what we give you for free, we will either pause your app or ask you to put in a credit card and pick a plan. The plans are the typical one that most people end up on right away is a team plan where you pay per seat. So usually if your app is in production in the App Store, you have 1 or 2 developer seats at $35. You're getting a much higher amount of hosting for that price. So we're giving you way more than we give you on the free plan. And if you need to exceed it, you can buy more at a lower price than on the free plan. So on the free plan, we're really trying to discourage you from running real commercial applications. You can run it for a while, but the idea is once it starts growing, you should get on the $35 plan. This should scale quite far, like the amount of data work you can do. So for example, 100 hours of computer time is roughly equivalent to processing 800,000 webhooks and running a function. So like Gadget actually taking the webhook, creating a record, and running my script 800,000 times would roughly equal 100 hours. And so you can imagine, like, for $40, how many webhooks am I buying? I'm buying roughly 800,000 webhooks if you're thinking just webhooks. And that gives you a little bit of an anchor point. We do have an agency plan. We are going to add it to this pricing page soon. We've realized that agencies are using us for lots of little apps, like 10, 20, 50 even sometimes. And so there's another plan we're going to introduce for agencies. The idea is if you're a public app developer, you probably stay on the team plan. And if ever your hosting starts to get really, really high, where you have 10,000 merchants installing your app, just contact us and we'll put you on something custom that's cheaper. And if you're an agency or a merchant that's doing lots of small custom apps, you want to be on the agency plan, which we'll add to this page soon. All right, next question. Would it be possible to rebuild the Shopify Analytics dashboard in Gadget? Yes, it would be. There is one last feature that we're introducing next month that would make it a lot simpler. It's an data fetching language called Jelly that lets you do really, really fast computations like sums and counts without using SQL and in a performant way that we can guarantee the performance on. That is Jelly is gonna be live in beta sometime this month. If anyone's interested, drop your email in the chat and Emma will pick it up. And if you need access to it in production, it'll probably be June when it's production ready. But you can still find workarounds for building analytics in Gadget, and it's actually one of the most common examples of apps that people build, custom apps. Last question from the submitted set: how to quickly set up an admin dashboard with Gadget. I think I've covered that, so I won't do it again. As soon as you connect Gadget to Shopify, you get an embedded admin UI. So you just need to go through the connection flow right away, and the landing screen you land on is actually your embedded UI. It's served by a Gadget file, and you can just edit that file. I'm going to assume this question was answered by my demo, and I won't dwell on it more than that. Someone asked how... Yeah, sorry, go ahead.
We did get quite a few questions like throughout the live session. I know that we're pretty much almost out of time. So I just want to say, like, maybe for any that didn't get answered, we can find another way to answer them, because I don't think we'll get to all of them in the next 2 minutes. And Jolly very quickly wants to know if it supports non-embedded apps, which I believe, Mo, it does.
Do.
But
yes.
Yeah, embedded apps are just the more complicated part often. So we brag about that.
And they're kind of a requirement on Shopify side. So we can follow up on the rest of the questions if you prefer that, Emma.
I think we're just out of time. So if everybody's okay with that, we will find a way to get all your questions answered. Maybe it'll be another recorded call. We'll figure that out. But you haven't been forgotten. We'll make sure that we get to you.
Perfect. Thank you, folks, for joining. We're also going to send a questionnaire to get some feedback. And like I said, I think... I sense there's a lot of hunger for like watching real apps get built. What I will do is I'll talk to Emma about scheduling another session, less focused on concepts, which was the point of this session, and more focused on watch me build 3 Shopify apps end to end and ask me questions along the way. I'll try to get that on the schedule, and I'll make sure Emma emails all of you folks so that you know it's available.
Thanks, everyone, for attending. If anything wasn't answered, we will get to it, just not on this call, but we'll be in touch. Thanks, all.
Take care, folks.
Bye.